So last time you mentioned Ndege Road, and there was a relation to the aviation industry. So tell us about that.
Yes, Ndege Road in Karen is named after an aeroplane, which was owned privately. Karen Blixen, who lived in Kenya in the early 20s up to late 20s. In fact, she left Kenya in 1931, had a friend and they fell in love. His name was Dennis Finch Hatton. Karen Blixen herself was Danish, but Dennis Finch Hatton was of British origin. When they fell in love, they started living together in Karen's house, which is today the Karen Blixen Museum in Karen. Dennis Finch Hatton was a pilot. He was a very avid aviator. He likes to fly, and he also owned a personal plane. He had his own personal plane. And it was arranged between him and Karen that he would establish a landing ground quite accessible to her home. And this was done. They established a landing ground and built a shed to serve as a hangar for the aircraft. And Dennis Finch Hatton and Karen Blixen used to take off from that landing ground to visit their friends in Kenya, in Malindi, in the south coast, as well as parts of northern Kenya like Kipia, Nakuru, and Naivasha, etc. Now that landing strip is situated in the area, in the proximity of the current Ndege Road in Karen. And Ndege Road was named after the plane that Finch Hatton owned and operated from there. So today we have Ndege Road to remind us of Karen Blixen's friend, Dennis Finch Hatton, who operated and ran an aircraft from Ndege Road of today.
So Ndege Road is the runway. Where
Yes,
Ndege Road is, that was his runway.
yes, that was his runway.
Um, so you've mentioned that he used to use this to go and his planes to go and visit their friends in other parts. So this was part of the culture uh, back in that time.
Yes, it was part of the culture. The settlers and most of the British people who came here, uh, some of them came from royal families and had brought in a lot of money, and they loved pleasure. They loved to travel and enjoy life. And Kenya, they found a very pleasant, and the experience of the beach, the highlands, the lowlands, the game parks, and a number of them were actual hunters. They were actually hunting wildlife for trophy and so on. So it was a very profitable trade. And a number of them owned aircraft to move around the country. We'll mention the settlers of Laikipia, the north of Laikipia. Some of these ranches are still in existence. We shall mention Naivasha and Nyandarua. Nyandarua, as we have probably heard in the past, we had a set called the Happy Valley set, composed of white men and women, very wealthy, who loved fun, who loved to enjoy life and spend most of their time in enjoying this life, men and women. And they danced away, they partied, they had dinners all over, played games, and the overflow, the part of the crowd was living in Naivasha, and Naivasha area also had its own number of settlers around the lake, and a number of them had landing grounds. They had runways in their own estates, and some of them exist up to today. And so we have the Happy Valley set in Nyandarua, particularly the place called Wanjohi Valley in Kipipiri in Naivasha, in Nyandarua. And then we have Naivasha, all having private airstrips. And then we have the other group along the coastline, having holiday homes and runways in their coastal estates. So the white set really enjoyed themselves in Kenya, uh, flying around with their African servants, having mansions, parties, clubbing, and so on. So the aviation industry was also developing. They contributed quite a lot to the development of the aviation industry at that time in the early days, mainly as private investors, private flyers, and their own planes.
You mentioned that the private ranches, the popular one, at least that I know, is the one in Nanyuki, the airstrip, and the ranches are still there today. So are they still privately owned, or what did they contribute to maybe the bigger aviation industry in Kenya, or are they still ongoing as their own businesses or just family owned?
Once the private airstrips, they officially they are called airstrips because they don't have the full equipment of an airport. The main structure is a landing ground, which is paved and approved for landing of light aircraft. I think most of them have a limited capacity of passengers, up to about 10 passengers, including the crew. The private airstrips or landing grounds are known as airstrips, which are lying on private estates. They are recognized as such by the Kenya Airports Authority and licensed to operate by the same authority. Kenya Airports Authority also carries out regular inspections of these airstrips, even in private estates. The other airstrips outside private lands are public. There are many public airstrips in Kenya. In fact, they are in the hundreds in this country. Now, for operations, the air operations of the aircraft, privately owned and operating in private ranches, is regulated by the Kenya Civil Aviation Authority. This means that planes taking off from any private airstrip in Kenya must be authorized to do so. It can't do so before authority of the air control service. So it communicates with the air controller and then is authorized and directed to take off in a certain direction, to maintain a certain height, and so forth and so on. The same case goes when it is flying around, it must stay in touch with the flight controller, and when it comes to landing, it has already fired its flight path. It has indicated where it's going. Before landing, it notifies the air controller, who guides it right to the landing place. So they are private, but they work within the limits of the law, just like the big airports. Because if they are allowed to fly haphazardly, they might interfere with the big planes which carry large numbers of passengers. Yes.
And what are your quick thoughts on the title that Kenya is the gateway into, is it Africa or East Africa?
I think Africa would be right, but in a way, it has played quite a big part as a gateway to Eastern Africa, and this is practical because most of those flights that come to Kenya carry passengers who connect to other destinations within East Africa. So people come from the neighboring countries, they get in Nairobi to connect with a flight going to a further destination.
Is it that JKIA or our industry, was it the first in Eastern Africa? Or what makes us have that title?
No, in Nairobi has always been a center of activities in East Africa, both during the colonial times and at independence. Um, when the British were ruling, the colonial powers were operating in East Africa. First of all, they made Nairobi as the center of operations, and therefore Nairobi gained importance over other centers in East Africa, and therefore logically aviation followed. So the first port of arrival was Nairobi before they moved to the other countries. And also logically, the business moved also like that. And for a very long time, there were no direct flights to Europe from Uganda or Tanzania. They used to fly into Nairobi from where they took off to distant countries. And vice versa, when they returned, they landed in Nairobi, took a local flight, East African flight, to their destination. But the picture has changed. So Nairobi has got importance, has grown, but also other countries, the ones I've mentioned, Uganda, Tanzania, and Rwanda, particularly Rwanda, have invested very highly in the aviation, in their own national carriers, and they are flying to far off destinations from their capital cities. So Nairobi, coming back again to Nairobi, I can say it's also a gateway to Africa because a lot of passengers from West Africa um, have been using Nairobi as a point to take off, to connect to flights, particularly in the Far East, in India, in China, and generally in the Far East, and vice versa.